today, and the place I wanted to start was the questions we kind of left off with in previous discussion, and that is, who are the victims here? And as I suggested to you, you could name a lot of people who are kind of victims in one way or another in the novel. And so what I'd like to do is just ask you that question: who are the victims in The Water's Edge? And you can choose the more obvious ones or the less obvious ones. But let's just start with identifying them and just identify a couple. And then what we'll do is, after you've identified a couple, choose one and then make the argument for how and why the victim. But let's just start by identifying a couple. And you can just give a kind of a thumbnail version of why they're victims. So just talking with people sitting around you, why don't we just start by identifying a couple people or a couple characters here, and then just a kind of a brief thought about why that character is a victim. So let's start with that question. Okay, let's hear what you kind of came up with here. Let's hear what you came up with in listing out a few people. Yeah, Charlie.
Jonas was a victim because he was so trusting and then ended up being taken advantage of.
Too trusting. Let me get this to a bigger font size here. Okay. Other ones. Yeah, what's your name there?
Josh.
Josh, right.
Christine from
Okay.
she's not physically like a victim, but like just mentally she puts one down.
Other ones. Hannah.
The teacher, I think his name is Alex, who never suspected him of having it going for the wrong reason, so we don't really know why he hasn't.
You didn't say it, but I think it's right. Because he's gay, he's sort of like in the target, sort of. I'll just put because. Okay, right. So kind of an intolerant community turns on the non-normative person, sort of. Kendall, right?
Yeah, the families, like specifically the mothers of the boys who went missing because they're like suffering the loss of their children.
Okay, so the mothers of missing boys, and why?
Because they're like, I guess they're victims of like murdering unborn children.
Okay, right. So that they're lost sons, right? So their sons were, in a sense, the legal victims, but they're victimized because of the loss they suffered. Yeah, good point. Other ones? Agnes.
I hate to admit, but you can also say Rainer to also victim.
Okay.
Just in the simple sense that their times are pristine and neglects her love for him.
Okay. So, neglected emotionally, should we put? Maybe? Yeah, name?
Christian.
Christian.
Going off this quote at the end, it says, as long as adults make mistakes and as long as parents abuse it, they can be abused. So from that, you can kind of make a case for Brian and the two boys and, like, say how, you know, they are also victims, even though they are also victimizers. So it's kind of, you can kind of make a case for a bunch of different.
Okay. You want to just give me a specific...
Oh, so Brian.
Okay.
And then, so him in terms of his parents or growing up.
Okay, right. How do you spell his... I'm forgetting how to spell his name again. The main pedophile, right? So how do you spell the name again? Anyone? Yeah. Okay. Victim. I mean, this is one of the challenges of the novel, right? It gives us a pretty good reason to like see him as a victim. And how does that happen? Right, interrogation. So there's the police procedural. Remember we talked about genre and the way that the novel uses interrogation to give us a pretty rich biography of him, and thereby sort of see his victimization. So right? It's the right, victim becomes victimizer. The old sort of thing, right? You know, like we think it's a sort of like a popular notion of abuse. I mean, popular in the sense of widely believed. That is, that people who suffer abuse internalize these structures of authority and mistreatment of others, and as a consequence, despite the anathema, you know, how much they hate the abuse themselves, they end up as adults repeating the abuse that they suffered as young people. So this is, you know, victim becomes a victimizer. Excellent point. This is like one of the challenges of the novel to us. Think about, right, victimhood. Okay, other ones. Kaya.
We talk about how like the town as a collective is kind of a victim just because the townspeople really don't know how to deal with something like this.
Unprepared to deal with what are they unprepared to deal with? Murder. Okay. Of a child. Okay. So yeah, even the town itself, right? That there's a bad apple among us that sort of is the victimizer in a sense. Austin?
And they also live with insecurity.
Okay, so I'll just add here, put lost innocence. Right, that of course, like that notion of lost innocence, right, is on the one hand that we can't be victimized. It wouldn't occur to us to be victimized, right? It's like if you're going about your life, right, never been broken, your apartment or home has never been broken into, and then all of a sudden someone breaks in and steals your computer or whatever. You feel loss of innocence, right? That I didn't think that would happen, and suddenly there my bike is gone or whatever. That you weren't prepared to deal with it in a sense. You didn't expect it, didn't anticipate it, and it happened to you. Same thing, lost innocence, right? This can't happen in this town, and then suddenly it does happen. How do we deal with that? So there's a sense of, you know, that's part of it. Tapule?
I would say in a sense that the officers themselves are victims too. Victims to like their job title and what they're supposed to do, because everyone now is like, you guys need to solve this, or because it's your job, and da da da, and they're trying their hardest, but like all the pressure, it's like,
I'm just understanding here, so that there's like I'm trying to understand. So are you saying like they have inadequate resources to do what they're supposed to? It's like too big a responsibility for them?
yeah.
Okay.
And people are
Unrealistic expectation, shouldering unrealistic expectations. Right? That in a way that sometimes we put make sort of superheroes out of these people who can't live up to it, and as a result, they continually fail to deliver what we want them to deliver. But in a way, the problem is the public's expectations. Right? The public is never wrong, after all. Right? Jennifer.
I would also say, in addition to that, the officers, specifically Scar and Sarah, are also victims of Rain's lies.
Okay.
It's in the next 3 pages of the next chapter after all of this was being finished by today. But he's still trying to pretend that he's like he's paralyzed from the waist down. He can't really walk. So based on that kind of information, what can they really do? So they can't do anything since he's telling lies, and they're doing the best they can, but nothing's coming up.
Yeah, it's an interesting example because, in a sense, right, one of the things we expect from detectives or officers, investigators, whatever, is that they're able to see through the lies. I mean, maybe that's the unrealistic expectation. Is that that's what we want them to do. They're supposed to be tough and not believe, right? And treat people in a way that gets around the facades, and yet they, of course, they're humans too, right? So that there's a little bit of a moral complication there. Charlie.
Edwin was victimized. He was bullied in school a little bit, and then the real or imagined neglect by his mother for Ingomar.
We'll put bullied and neglected in scare quotes just to mark that that's a contested point. Elizabeth?
The first pedophile, I forget what his name is, that they don't talk to.
Philip.
He was also victimized because even though they're just covering their bases, like, he was still, like, paying for his, like, past actions. So he's a victim because he was kind of, like, assumed that he would know something about the crime or maybe he committed it.
They kind of they assume he's guilty in a sense, which is it's another interesting one, right? Where, I think we could all agree that there's a strong social hostility to sex offenders and pedophiles in particular, right? And we just institutionally recognize that with the registry of sex offenders, right? So that if you're someone registered sex offender moves into your neighborhood, it's on the internet and you can find out about it, and that person is like, they're wearing the red letter, right? And there's these laws that assume guilt, right? And so even if that person is, whatever the circumstances of that individual's crimes, whether there's some horrible, rapist, or whether it's some sort of more ambiguous circumstance, we nevertheless mark those people out. And this is the case with this Philip, is that he's like this reformed, sort of ostensibly reformed criminal, right? Or reformed pedophile, and yet nevertheless these issues come. So is he a victim, or is that just desserts? He screwed it up bad, and now he's bearing the consequence for the rest of his life. Derek. Okay, boyfriend, a crook. Great. You can see, like, right away, I start inventorying the novel. Every character in the novel is a victim. Is there anyone here who's not a victim?
The dog.
The what?
The dog.
The dog? So here's what I want to do now. Take one of these and make an argument for why victimhood, but then take another, and I want you to make an argument against victimhood for that one. Okay, so both a pro and a con. And you can do it with the same character if you want, or you can choose two separate ones. But a pro and a con for thinking about victimhood. And in a way, what we're asking then is, just let's start there. Pro and con arguments about victimhood for these characters. Okay, so we're kind of thinking of pros and cons here, and then after this we can turn to this issue of sort of from the victim, right, the sufferer of the wrong, to the perpetrator, like who's responsible. But let's just start with this victim thing here. So name again, yeah, sorry, Kathleen, right?
An example for Reinhardt is that he is being neglected emotionally by his wife. However, he's neglecting him because of his behavior. So it's kind of a vicious cycle.
Okay. So that on the one hand, he is getting this kind of emotional neglect, but he's such a jerk that she doesn't want to. It's like she can't sort of barely be around him, right? And so in a way, it's just desserts. Anyone else right about that one? Okay, other examples that you took up? I mean, it's like it becomes a question like, does this person deserve it? How do we figure that out? Kaya?
We talk about with the mother, you could argue that she let her son walk home alone and he's only 7.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately she kind of did this to herself.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about the same type of lack of action with Christine, how she just doesn't really have she doesn't have the energy to take action for herself and leave Reinhardt. And so that's ultimately creating her situation. Whereas like in both cases, they could have done something for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where a child is made vulnerable because of a parental decision. Does the parent blame him or herself, or the person who was the agent of the victimization? Right? I mean, everyone has dealt with that maybe not that long ago, or a long time ago, right? As a child or as a young person, where you're sort of having this ongoing struggle with parents about the limits, right? What being protected from danger by a family, or taking responsibility for yourself, right? Of course, the more responsibility you take for yourself, in a sense, the more vulnerable you are. But if you're overprotected, then of course that has a cost as well, right? But whether that's a strained relationship with your parents or sort of a failure to be able to take the initiative, you could say that someone like Christine, maybe one argument, right, is that she was sheltered, right? Is not used to taking initiative, and she's in someone like Reinhardt, she's seeking a person who would treat her in the way that she is being treated, right? That she's not, the reason she's not taking the initiative, she's not used to taking the initiative because she never has taken it, and as a consequence, she finds herself in this circumstance, right? Which is like the popular idea of like codependency, where the thing that I don't like is the very thing I seek out because that's the way I know how to act. Right? And so these victimization things are. So do you blame her because she put herself in that circumstance, or do you blame him because he's a jerk and he's jerking her around? Jerk. But we'll come back to that one. Other ones. Ben.
I guess Alex. So the suspicion is directed at him because he's inviting the boys over to his house, and I think it was chapter 36. It talks about how that they needed like a scapegoat for the murders of the two boys, and even though that like he's just drawing more suspicion at him, directed at him, just because he's still inviting the boys over. He knows their names, and he's only inviting like young boys and no girls. I guess he's not really, in my opinion, he's not really considered a victim just because he's putting it on. He's like putting this upon himself.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one, right? Where remember in talking about victim, one of the things we were talking about was how bad circumstances require a victim and then a scapegoat, right? And in part, the scapegoat is that person, both the victim who sort of like ends the cycle of the problem, but also there's like a guilty party, right, who gets fingered for the whole thing, right? And the thing, right, the thing we love to do is find that outsider, I mean, as a society, right, find the outsider, the person who doesn't fit, that's the one who did it, right? Where the problems of the community get all wrapped up in a nice package and assigned to that person who's somehow the one who doesn't fit, the transgressor, the person who's the problem, and it all comes from them, right? So Alex is an instance of that where, in some ways, he's like the easy mark, right? He doesn't fit in this little town, and he's inviting these boys over and so forth, no girls, and there's a case made against him. But on the other hand, you know, like that kind of scapegoating, what is it really doing? It's a dodge itself, right? In a way, where the problems that are at the root of the thing, whether it's like these parents aren't paying adequate attention to their children, you know, or not monitoring them, and so forth, no one wants to admit that responsibility, and so like, it's Alex. You externalize your own problem and say, it's that one who's different than us. He's the one who's the source of the problem here. So you can see that the way that, I mean, this is clearly like an instance in the novel, an episode that's made to, you know, it's trying to stage the problems that are of victimhood and guilt that are at the heart of the novel and make them kind of ambiguous, right? And thought-provoking. Other ones. Cindy.
I would argue the officers are not victims because, like, yeah, it's a tough job, but they went into it willingly with the understanding that these are the responsibilities that people have to them.
Okay.
And while they're unrealistic, it's unfortunate, but they still have that understanding going into this career.
Okay, so part of it is we can argue at some of these that's the deal, right? Of course, it's unpleasant to have those sorts of expectations, but you don't take that responsibility without recognizing the implications of it, right? The sort of almost like with great power comes great responsibility, right? This kind of like, we hear that in, war making oftentimes. I think that these are these sorts of social roles that you can't kind of play the victim there because you've taken on so much responsibility. And that's part of the attraction of them, right? Is that you're a very empowered person. The officer of the law, they interpret the law, they enforce the law, right? And so in that way, we draw the line and say they're not victims. Right? Jennifer.
I think there's a lot of loopholes to deciding who's a victim and who's not. For example, Grain.
Mm-hmm.
If you just look at him in terms of the present, he isn't a victim because as a grown man, you would expect him to have a high moral conscience to know that what he's doing isn't morally correct.
Mm-hmm.
But then you can say that he's the way he is now in the present time because of his past with abuse of his mother.
Right. So on the one hand, he's a legal adult. He needs to be able to control 100% these sorts of impulses. But on the other hand, the novel strongly suggests he's a victim of circumstances himself, right? And this is part of the reason we're talking about the victim here, just as an aside, is that all of these novels, this is like Scandinavian crime fiction, we're talking about the main part of it. The perpetrator is always a victim, it seems, and part of the social criticism is pointing at the circumstances that produce the victim and asking the reader to think about what generates the victim perpetrator. If you want to read a really good example of it, there's a novel by, I'll write here at the bottom here, Henning Mankell, Sidetracked. It's from, I think, 1996. You can also, it was actually done by PBS too, or BBC, so you can watch, if you want to watch it, I'm sure you can find it probably on Netflix. But anyway, repeated over and over again, these sorts of victim deals. Anyone else have a good example they want to add here that thought was interesting? Yeah.
I guess Edwin is physically big, so he has the choice to talk against the other small.
Yeah, Edwin is an interesting case, right? Because he's like 10 years old and suffering physically. Is he a victim? What do we expect from children? In terms of self-control. It's kind of it's like an instance where I would just say one place to look in these novels is like the bodies of the characters, the way the bodies are described, or a part of the story, because the body is often a very important symbol, should we say. And it's a symbol because these are often melodramatic. There's a melodramatic structure. That is, you can read the bodies in a moral way. Something's wrong with Edwin, and we can see it. The novel says you can see something is wrong here. So that it's not even like it's not even about the character himself, but what he stands for. One might argue, and what does he stand for? What's the problem here? Is it he's just like out of control, or is it the mom is like neglectful, or what's the source of the victimhood? Actually, let's turn to the related that question then, and taking up that you can take up the same example or a different one. My question is, who's guilty? Who's to blame for the circumstance? Or does that get blocked? Take a few minutes to look at one of your examples, or you can choose a new one and ask yourself, who's the victimizer? Who's the character? Or doesn't even have to be a character? Is there some force or entity, institution, whatever? What's the root of the problem? On your argument, reading the novel, not just kind of like making it up, but trying to look at the novel and see what it says. So choose one of your examples and make an argument for who's guilty for the victimization. Okay, let's hear what people had to say. So the question was, who's to blame? We'll play the blame game here. Emily?
Yeah, I saw the first kid who died. When he was walking, he was hesitating on if he should get on a stranger's car or not. Then the guy offered him to drive to let him take control of the car and drive. And so he got tempted by it. But he knows that he shouldn't be on a stranger's car, so it's kind of like him knowing the fact that he shouldn't be on it.
Okay, so great use of pointing to some details in the novel that sort of complicate things, where the child knows he or she shouldn't be doing that thing, and yet is tempted by the offer of these sorts of experiences, right? Pretending to drive the car or whatever, or helping out with an adult task, and so forth. So where are you pointing your finger here? That is, who's guilty? I mean, are you saying the kid is guilty, or what do you?
Well, I'm not saying he's guilty. I'm saying that he kind of knows the consequences. Like he had a feeling that he shouldn't do that. So he's kind of guided himself in the decision.
Okay, so I mean, one question is, does the novel blame the children a little bit for being too trusting? That the kids themselves are, in a sense, to blame because they're not tough enough, right? Not enough street smarts. So I'll just leave it as a rhetorical question you can think about here. I'm sure other people have thoughts about it. Does anyone want to comment on that? Yeah.
Well, I think that there's trust in the community. I lived in central Denmark, in Copenhagen, and people left baby carriages outside the grocery store. They were too big to go down the aisles, and the assumption was that people don't run off with children or abuse them. And there's like a community trust.
Okay, so maybe, so then the question, that's like to step out a level, that why are the kids trusting, right? They're not mature adults who can kind of are fully formed, right, they're in some ways a reflection of community standards and community expectations. And so they are vulnerable because they live in a community that's very trusting. There's a great example of this point. I don't know, it must have been in the early 90s maybe. There was a well-known Danish actress whose name I can't remember now, who lived in New York City at the time. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Nancy. As Nancy pointed out, it's a very common practice to like take prams, where babies are sleeping, and leave them out. You can leave them outside of a store. Maybe it happens a little bit less, at least in my time living over there now, than it used to, but it still does. And it's a very common practice when babies are napping to push the pram out the door to because there's this notion that the baby should have cold air or fresh air while it naps. And so you see all the times prams set out with babies in them in these Nordic countries, just napping or while the parent is doing something. So anyway, to come back to this actress, she's living in New York City and was at some restaurant, sitting inside the restaurant and left a pram out front and was arrested by the New York City police and prosecuted for child neglect because of this thing. And then the big defense was a cultural practice and so forth. I can't remember what actually happened they probably ended up giving her a ticket or something like that. But it was it got a lot of attention because it seemed like such a cultural disconnect between the Danish expectations and American expectations. But, the question is about street smarts. Is it the kid's responsibility, as Emily points out, to have a sense there's something amiss here? Or is the kid a reflection of his or her community, and those are just the expectations and the norms? You can see, right, where's the guilt? Who's guilty here? Casey? Yeah. So in one sense, you can see this is a very fatalistic novel. That's what Casey's arguing, right? That these things happen, as horrible as they are, and there's not that much we can do to stop them, right? And so that guilt, it's almost kind of a condition of, it's to put it in a fancy way, it's like an existential condition. That's the cost of being alive. You take these risks, and these things happen, and just there but for the grace of God go I, right? It could have been me. Don't feel good when it happens to someone else and not you, because it's going to happen to you next, right? You can feel really guilty if you're like, oh my God, I dodged the bullet that time, right? Because it could be you next time. But that's that's the fatalistic reading of the novel. Chow?
Yeah, we were talking about the root of all the things that because of human nature, because there's flaws everywhere, and every action that we do there's consequences and leads to another.
Okay. So this is another way to think about it. So is this a novel about evil? And Tao has said it's about human nature, right? And then when you say it think about it that way, is that the other side of the coin? There is an evil in human beings, and these are, in that sense you can say evil is the absence of good. That's where we have evil. And here we have an absence of good, and it's no one is immoral in the sense of trying to do bad things to others, but rather there's just a collective neglect that leads to bad circumstances, and that's the evil, right? So it sort of holds the mirror up rather than pointing a finger. That would be one reading of the novel, emphasizing fatalism and kind of circumstance and human nature. The other side would be a much more social reading of the novel, and it's trying to point its finger at specific institutions, specific attitudes, historically kind of identifiable problems. Cindy?
Yeah, I guess I was going to lead up to that. I look at it from a societal perspective, and so society itself is to blame here. Because while victimizing a child is wrong, we'll agree on that. Our society makes it so negative that somebody who has those feelings will never be able to talk about them, and they just internalize them until they explode.
Okay, so here's one reading. The novel certainly gives a lot of evidence to support that view, right? That, in fact, we live in such an intolerant society, right? And where are we at our most intolerant? Around sexuality, right? Or that's one view, right? There are others around violence, sexuality and violence going together. That's a place of extraordinary sensitivity and intolerance. And so anyone who's like doesn't fit the norms, they're not allowed. They can't. They need to be controlled. They can't speak about it, and they can't even speak its name, right? And as a result, they're forced into the corner, and then it explodes, and the cost is borne by the society, right? Because in putting them in the corner, there's no outlet, and when they finally blow, right? So it's this. Then we point to our own attitudes, right? Where's the problem? Look in the mirror. In your own intolerance of others, of difference. So that'll be another reading of the novel. We get from looking at victimhood and guilt. Other examples, we've been kind of focusing on August, but other examples of playing the blame game, guilt. Where does it belong? Tapula, you had your hand up before.
I understand like the whole society thing, and it makes sense when we were discussing it. But before we discussed that, I was thinking of like the guy himself, because if he hadn't, done what he did to Jonas in the first place, I mean, the book wouldn't even happen. You know what I mean? Like there would be nothing the society would be fearing. Edwin wouldn't be gone the next day. There isn't all this like fear going on in the town.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, that whole point of it's because they didn't have an outlet to talk about it. That's why they exploded. And then you also have to think about like, the whole like victim became a victimized type of thing. So it's like, who did that to him that made him the way he is, kind of thing. So.
I mean, there's an interesting one, right? It's the you can say, well, what's the problem? Why is his brain? Why is he the way he is? I mean, the novel strongly suggests, right? He himself has been victimized by his family that kind of made him the way he is. And what's their problem? Like physically beaten, this like repressive personality, right? The classic, the abusive family. And why are they abusive? Right? Because they use physical force to hammer their children into conformity and obedience. And so the problem then in a way is, if there's one problem, it's like the generation before that clubbed their children into submission and created all these neuroses and, psychoses and problems that then get visited on the next generation, these children. That's a classic, right? It was my parents that did it to me. So then again then we say, like, well, what's the problem here at bottom? It's the family, right? It's the family that's the problem. That sort of, with all its, then we're back to kind of like some kind of almost like a Freudian sort of thing where it's like these sorts of relationships within the family that shape people in ways that make them prone to do things or victimize others. Was there other Jennifer?
I feel like the novel is also hinting at something else. Like if the case of Jonas August never happened, maybe something still would have happened to Edwin, because it was a conversation between Scar and Sarah, I think it was. They were saying that, maybe it wasn't related to the pedophilia case at all, but just that it was a case of not getting enough attention from his mom. Because they questioned Tula Solid's mother, and they said that, when she met the man who's a fraud, she started putting all of her attention on the man instead of her child, and that the children should be like the greatest love of our life, and like we should put all of our attention to him. So regardless of what happened with Brain and his lust, I think something still would have happened with Edwin. Okay, so Edwin, and what's the relationship between Edwin and Jonas? It's a great point. I'm going to put it off until next time when we read the whole novel, because there's a lot. The whole Edwin story gets developed at the end of the novel, and if people haven't read it, there's a lot of evidence there that or just points of discussion in between about the relationship between the two crimes. There other ones that people thought about for guilt. There's a lot of good ones here. People must talk about. Charlie.
Edwin and Tula's relationship. Most of the blame should probably go to Tula, because Edwin is like on the cusp of being old enough to realize, like his intake of food is not good. But Tula has been cognizant enough. Edwin his entire life to know that you should be saying no and just hasn't had the willpower to, then also there's a little bit of guilt or a little bit of blame on his biological father for leaving and like setting up that wound to have like Ingmar come in and Tula to be like distracted from like
Right. So there's both a parental responsibility to like look out for the good health of the child, right? But also, on the other hand, like she's got her issues that she's trying to cope with, maybe not very successfully, and Edwin bears a price. So the guilt then gets distributed a little bit. Tao?
I'm just gonna answer that because of trauma, and that's led to Edwin feel insecure. His friend, he was neglected by his friend and his parents that making him want to be sweet to adult. That's like indirectly making him a victim of the.
Okay, so there's another interesting level there, right? That part of the problem with like victimhood, right, is that we learn to be victims. It's a role. It's a role one plays. That you think about the like on the schoolyard or sort of as teenagers, right? There people pick on one another, or kids pick on each other, or workplace bullying. It happens with adults too, of course. And the idea is that and we think that that person who was victimized by the bully didn't want to be bullied. Of course they didn't, but yet they know that role, and it's a way of this kind of codependent way of fitting in, right? To take the role of the person suffering that bullying, right? Of course, people might point out it's a way of getting attention to kind of like put up with the humor, put up with the jokes, put up with the abuse. And Edwin, as Tao suggests, is a little bit of that kind of character. He's kind of like puts himself in this role where he gets the worst of it. And whose fault is that? Emily?
Also, in the book, this one passage about Edwin's mother, like Edwin was begging her to get him to buy the ice cream, and she liked the baking part because no one ever had baked her in her life, so she was like feeling superior or something. I thought it was weird that she would like feel superior when her son baked her the ice cream.
Yeah, so I mean, with those dynamics come power, differentials, where to be the one in control, but from that person asking for that thing, right? The victim here. So yeah, are there other examples people want to bring up before we close up shop for the day? Okay, let's just summarize then. What we've tried to do is look at these key terms of victim and guilt and look at the way that they're important themes, that they bring together important themes in the novel. And bringing those together, they help us read the novel, but I think we'll also connect to other Scandinavian crime fiction. So on Thursday, we'll finish up discussion of The Water's Edge and look again at some of these relationships, especially more try to pull together some of the themes we've talked about and connect them to some of the issues of genre and reading the novel as a literary text. Okay, see you on Thursday.